poppin' everybody, Cerebral54. In this video I want to make a little discussion slash comparison with Copycat and Judge, these two supporters that we have in standard right now. If we had something like Juniper and N, which we actually did, we did have formats where these cards were around, and Judge and Copycat were also around, but they saw little to no play. But now that we don't have those better sort of more reliable options for supporters, it's kind of interesting because it kind of brings me back to the old school format for the third generation, where you had your Copycat that was originally printed in Team Rocket, and then Judge. Well, we had an N sort of back then with Team Rocket's admin. But it's interesting because what these cards do is basically they're the opposite of each other. Copycat, basically you hope your opponent has a big hand, so you copy them and draw more cards. And then Judge is always wants to limit your opponent's hand, and you get fewer cards too. So starting out with Copycat, it's pretty simple. If your opponent has a big hand, you basically get the same cards. So you hope your opponent gets a lot of cards, and then you get more cards in return. You dig more. If they have at least 6, then it becomes an extra Cynthia, okay. And if it has 5, then it becomes like a Tate and Liza, which I guess it's sort of another solid supporter that we gotta use right now. Now Judge is interesting because it limits your opponent's hand, and you can even do that from turn 1. So you always, it's different compared to N. It doesn't give you that sort of strong disruption like game, but it doesn't give you that good draw early too. So it's pretty interesting. So if you play this, let's say turn 1, you do your stuff, play your cards down, and then you draw 4 cards with this. It's a number that's not really that great, like 5 or 6 cards, but it's not even so little. Like with N, once you have a lot of prizes, drawing like 3 or less cards. With 4, it's sort of still respectable kind of thing. If you play this card without having too many cards in hand, less than 4. But if you do your stuff and then you play this card, turn 1, you always sort of disrupt your opponent heavily. It becomes like a strong hand rape card. When we start the game, we have 7 cards, so instantly putting up your opponent to 4. It's not something you gotta take lightly. They're gonna draw the extra one, so they will be left with 5 for the most part. But it's still, it's major disruption. So it really just boils down to what's your preference, but the type of deck that you're playing. Of course, player preference is an easy cop-out. It depends on what people like. But I feel like some of these cards, they have more benefits depending on the decks that are played. So for example, Copycat, if you're always trying to dig, you always want to draw a lot of cards and you want to set up quickly, and you know that if I get a consistent setup with my deck, I should probably win, or I should be in a good position to outplay my opponent and play a fair game and then win that way anyway. That's where Copycat comes in. And Judge is more for decks that maybe they think, okay, you know what, I'm kind of slow, or maybe I don't really need a lot of cards, so it's better for me to just slow down my opponent to disrupt them. Or Judge used in conjunction with cards like Mars and other hand rape cards too. That's the sort of decks I feel like it could be used. Now I see both of these cards, of course, Copycat, see play in decks, and Judge, I see this being used in things like Bustle. I saw it being used in decks like with the Side-Eye GX and Zorak GX, which is interesting because when you play decks like Stage 2, you want to set up, but it sort of depends on how you build your deck, because maybe you want to slow down your opponent, and you know that, okay, even though I'm not going to get a lot of cards, I know that I'm going to set up eventually, and slowing him or her down is more important for me. It depends on how you build your deck too. Some person might be thinking that I know that even if I rely on Judge, the way that my deck is set up, I'm going to get my pieces out eventually, and it's more important for me to disrupt my opponent, give him less cards to work with. Now, of course, something like Judge, it always affects both of your hand and your opponent's hand. So sometimes if they have less cards and you got to play this too, then you're going to give them cards. So it's the same sort of aspects N had, and any supporter that shuffles in your hand and your opponent's hand. So Copycat is kind of like the easy card to use. Is only affects you, doesn't really disrupt your opponent. If he has a big hand, you get more cards. If you don't, then it becomes dead. But Copycat is easy to sort of tech out. Like in my decks, I run one, like my one of Chorus and Expanded. Of course, it's a card that has a huge payout, but you never really want to rely on what your opponent has in hand. They can control how good your supporter is, which is why for the most part you'll find people say that Tate and Liza is the more reliable of the two. Now I'm not sure now that we have Whitney if she's going to be sort of replace these cards as the other supporters used in decks, because basically you got to run your Cynthia, you should run your Lily because she's too good, and then Tate and Liza are pretty good as well, have that sort of switching aspect flexibility option as well. But I think most decks either run both of these cards or one of each card. They favor this card since we don't have blessed supporters like Juniper / Sycamore and N. But now with Whitney, I'm not sure if she's gonna. I feel like in some decks she's gonna be able to replace these guys for that one consistency, and you don't want the disruption aspect. But in a lot of decks, maybe that don't really discard and run Ultra Balls, it might not be so easy to get her good effect off. You need to have a couple of them at least two, so that you can draw 5 cards and shit. If we don't consider her, the question is, which card do you run from these two? Which is the best card? And like I said, at the end of the day, it comes down to personal preference. Both cards, they can be pretty good, but to sum it up, if I had to give you guys a summary, Copycat is just your easy, put one tech in a deck, it might be good. At worst, even if you draw 5 cards, is respectable in this format, and it goes better from there. And then Judge, if you run a disruption deck, maybe you run cards like Mars too, other ways to discard cards. You really want to control what your opponent has in hand, and you want to slow things down depending on your deck, depending on what kind of control deck you're running, then maybe he can become better. Maybe even a mix in between. Like I've said, it really just depends. But to be honest, for my decks, I always value consistency. Most of them, 99% of them. Decks that I run cards like Mars and I want to slow things down and I'm not looking for pieces. Maybe just like when I was doing hit and switch with Deoxys in that one game I showed you guys. Then Judge becomes a good asset. It becomes a good card to use because you're not looking for a lot of stuff. So it makes sense to try and disrupt your opponent. In ways, Judge can actually be pretty busted, like I've said, with the turn 1 effect. I'm not sure how I feel about cards that limit your opponent's hand and they can start doing that turn 1. Like we used to have at least red card, but now we have Marshadow from Shining Legends and Judge. Sometimes, that Judge or that Marshadow turn 1 or even turn 2 can be enough to just completely sway the game in your favor, like you control the game from then on. But yeah, Copycat and Judge. I like Copycat more, to be honest. Using these, I use the old school images too for you guys. There is an older Copycat that got released in Rocket, but I decided to go with the hard gold, soul, silver ones. Judge was originally released in Unleashed, I'm pretty sure. Both interesting cards. As long as we don't have any more reliable supporters, then it basically becomes a sort of a mind game of what do you want to run? Do you want to control how many cards your opponent gets? Do you want to let them get a lot of cards and then you copy them back? It's sort of how it used to be when people played in the OG days. We had cards like, well, the Copycat and the Team Rocket's admin and other supporters that you really had to be mindful of what your opponent was doing and about what you were doing to take advantage the best of all the cards. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this little rant. I hope I got a few good points across, and hope you enjoyed the video. Sabro24, hope you guys subscribe, leave a like, share this with your friends, and I'll see you guys next time. What up?